from a novel called The Unteachable, which is forthcoming with Anti-Oedipus Press. The novel takes the form of a single unbroken paragraph, and this extract comes from about halfway through. But there is something else, and this is not all. Klosowski writes that Nietzsche did not merely think himself into isolation, which any fool can envisage. He committed himself to the unteachable with it. This academic, trained in the disciplines of science in order to teach and train others, found himself compelled to teach the unteachable, writes Klosowski. And by implication, the grandson said, anyone working with Nietzsche must do so too. They will be committed to the unteachable, or they should commit themselves to the unteachable, or they should know if they commit themselves and fail, or fail to commit but know they ought, that anything they say falls short of what might be said, and anything that might be said must fall short in any case. It is a feature of the unteachable, he said. As it was always folly to think that anything derived from Nietzsche could be straightforwardly taught or indeed communicated adequately. And when he sat behind his desk at the village school, the grandson, the son of the son, felt he would follow Klosowski on Nietzsche and declare that anything cogent must be parody, and that he would be reduced to parody in attempting to say anything cogent about Nietzsche, but that if he refused to attempt anything cogent, he would be reduced to saying something ridiculous, or at best, nothing, although he felt he would actually merely just end up saying too much, or that he would have too much to say, and so would surely say nothing because of his speaking, and not because of his silence. And on it went. I have nothing to say, the teacher thought as he watched his pupils in silence. I have read my Nietzsche well enough and know that it will have no implications for my teaching, no cogent implications, and that if my professional practice is to be at all influenced by Nietzsche, it will also be a travesty of Nietzsche. Actually, he thought, the very notion of a travesty in this context will also be a travesty. To worry about writing a travesty of Nietzsche or enacting a travesty of Nietzsche is just another elaborate travesty, and so it goes on. And I have read my Nietzsche, said the son of the son, and I have read my Klosowski on Nietzsche, who writes that Nietzsche's commitment to the unteachable left him with nothing else but to affirm the existence of a universe with no other end than that of being what it is. So it is, so it is, said the grandson, the teacher. As Nietzsche thought himself into isolation, the isolation of his thinking and the isolation of his suffering, he had only himself to hear, was reduced to hearing himself alone, and as he listened to himself, listened to the universe such as it was, he affirmed the existence of a universe that had no other end than being what it is, an obvious proposition, hard to affirm. So wrote the man who once was Klosowski, said the son of the son. As the grandson sat back behind his desk and looked at the village children seated in their stocks, he would call them that, the grandson thought, I have nothing at all to say to them, not in the manner of a teacher. And because I have read my Nietzsche well enough, and because I have read Klosowski on Nietzsche, I find myself somewhat broken in my teaching effort by the contrary desire to affirm the existence of a universe with no other end than being what it is. He said he knew all this was pushing it, and he was aware it could be said more plainly. Had not somebody, a better Klosowski interpreter, once said that the unteachable holds open to chaos, where the teachable pretends to not know what chaos is, even as it remains at its mercy. And so, what can be taught will therefore be anything that does not run the risk of entertaining chaos and contributing to the collapse of science. The teachable does not contribute to the collapse of science, meaning all cogent systems of knowledge. It cannot contribute should it wish to, and if the teachable has some intuition of the regions where science collapses, it cannot reach into those regions or properly speak of them. Even as the teachable might describe the collapse of science within its own terms as a collapse to be itemized, it still would not contribute to that collapse, would remain tied to its cogency. Non-institutional knowledge, unbridled knowledge, will not even be recognized and, of course, will not be transmitted. It has no place, he said. It can claim no place. There is no place that would hold it. Only things that can be given clear limits will be taught or will visit the horizon of the teachable. It is a fundament of teaching to remain within these limits. If teaching ever gestures to the universe, this very gesture is a simple fraud. The teacher can only gesture to the insides of a collective confinement. So-called liberty in this context is the freedom to rattle around in a box. When he had attempted to teach death, for instance, so the grandson, the teacher, said, he had only ever taught elements of death. I stood before the village children and attempted to teach them death, he said, and was frustrated. The fundaments of existence could not be approached or could only be described by the evasions that the sum total of knowledge had provided, which is to say, these fundaments could only be approached in such a way that the village children remained profoundly unaffected. He said he walked to school, and as he walked, felt all the horrors of his existence. These were his own fundaments, and felt equally frustrated that he could tell none of it to the children. This, or something like it, is what he was thinking as he accompanied the village children into the yard for their daily exercise, and as he watched them, or as he looked outward in their direction, he decided this is what he would nonetheless do. He would attempt the unteachable in the presence of the village children, and when he felt the horrors of his existence, he would feel it with them and in their presence, and without resorting to the teachable. The village children were occupied to not hardly notice that the grandson, the teacher, was preoccupied, that is to say, otherwise engaged, as the teacher stood at the corner of the yard, not watching them minutely, as might be imagined, but thinking. Their teacher was occupied with thinking about the unteachable, and if his eyes were open, they saw nothing, and his gaze was fixed in any case. Not a trace of his inattention spread to the activities of the yard. These village children were not much capable of feeling unobserved, as he perhaps knew. Village life, as he might have said, had prepared them for the elemental suspicion that nothing was not seen or would not leave a trace that would tell of them. If they defied the moral orders of their village, they did so in the knowledge that everything might be revealed, and so their defiances were small and plain. The children felt their teacher was watching them closely as usual, or was observing them as might be expected, and so they acted as though they were being observed minutely, expecting it as children do when they sense the presence of an adult. Not at all how adults act under the same conditions. These adults perform themselves to a vision of themselves, located somewhere out of time. whereas children practice themselves in the moments they are given. The children returned to the classroom following their exercise, and they resumed the inane task he had set for them that day. They did all this with the habitual expressions of village children in the context of inanity and the practiced gestures of the bored and listless. And as they sat, they did more or less what was expected, as he continued to think about what Klosowski and about what Nietzsche might have said or thought. I shall affirm a universe, he thought, and I shall do it without teaching it. Here I am, and as I sit, I affirm a universe. I shall do it with Nietzsche at hand and following Klosowski. I shall commit myself to the unteachable. It was a difficult assignment, he decided, and if Klosowski or Nietzsche is to be followed, I must resign myself to this difficulty. Exactly how I am to commit myself to the unteachable is not entirely clear, he thought, although the nature of this commitment must be entirely at odds with anything remotely taught or teachable. Surely I have never been taught anything remotely applicable to the problem of the unteachable, and can rely upon none of the resources I might have gathered from anything that I have read. Not even Klosowski, he decided, can be relied upon, and I must take Klosowski piecemeal. Even Klosowski, for sure, too much Klosowski could lead me astray as I commit to the unteachable in the context of this village school. But as he sat and wondered how he might do all that, given the constraints of the space and the natural limits of the children before him, and as he began to wonder if his true problem was that he did not have a Nietzschean temperament, whatever that might be, the village teacher entertained an odd supposition. He would call it his private heresy or his profound misreading, depending on his temperament at the time. He came to wonder if his profession might have long intuited what he had only just intuited, and if his profession had intuited it far better, and whether his profession had actually for some time not already implemented what it long ago intuited and he had just planned. To call it a plan was excessive, he thought. The question rightly asked, he felt, which is to say, the question he ought to ask from this heretic perspective, was if the teaching profession had long ago set in place what he had just begun to anticipate from a very different frame of reference, following Klosowski on Nietzsche. Pretty much what I had in mind after Klosowski on Nietzsche, he thought, may have already been realized. The unteachable is not impossible at all. It is already here. The unteachable is already part of my work in this village school. And if the unteachable is at work here in this simple environment, it will be at work even more in the city school. In the city school, the unteachable will be fully implemented, or even more fully than here. The city school will affirm a universe with no other end than that of being what it is. And the same goes for the city college and the city university, if not also the city hall, perhaps even the city street, he thought. If I intuit rightly, he decided, these places also will have implemented the unteachable, will have organized themselves around the unteachable, not as Nietzsche might have envisaged, or not quite as one might think following Klosowski on Nietzsche, but just as effectively, if not more so. They already transmit death, for instance, and if any teacher ever attempted to teach death, which would mean if any teacher came and taught death particulars, these institutions were already transmitting death to their fundament.